Hello, R fans. Welcome to Module 3, in which we talk about advanced regression and dive into moderator analysis. Lots of fun stuff to cover. So I have the Module 3 handout here loaded up in RStudio. And actually, let me pump up the size of RStudio here just by clicking on Preferences. Make it a little bit bigger, maybe a 16. There we go. Make sure everybody can see there. You can also play with the themes and stuff. I prefer the dark mode myself, but there's lots of different cool appearance things you can do. Okay, so we're going to start by loading in some packages. First, we're going to start with the usual suspects by now, the tidyverse and the psych package. Tidyverse is all things data manipulation, cleaning, coding, management, and visualization. Psych is all things descriptive statistics and psychometrics. So we'll load those in. And then we're going to load our data in. We're going to use the dataset videogames.dta, and that's a Stata file. So we need to use the Haven package. And so I've got a library Haven. I'm going to create a new object called video games. And I'm going to load that in using the read_DTA function, which comes from the Haven package. And once that's loaded in, I'm going to use the glimpse function to get a look at that. So here up in my environment, I now have a data frame called video games. It is 442 rows and 4 columns. So I've got 442 observations and 4 variables. I've got ID, aggression, video games, and counts. ID is a general identifier variable. We're not going to use that one. Aggression is a standardized measure of aggression on a survey scale. It goes from, I think, 0 to 100. Video games is the number of hours a person reported playing video games in the past week. And counts is another validated scale that stands for callous, unemotional traits. It's sort of an antisocial personality measure. And it, again, is a standardized scale from 0 to, I think, maybe 60. Okay, so I highly recommend, if you have not yet, to watch the Module 3 lecture video, because I do a little bit deeper dive into these measures and talk a little bit about how this works as a moderator and how this particular analysis works well as a moderator analysis. But long story short, this is an example from social and personality psychology. And we're basically looking at this idea, does playing more violent video games lead to or predict more aggressive behavior? This is an argument that's been made back and forth for decades. And we're just using this as an example to study moderator analysis. All right, so we should always start with some descriptive statistics, and the describe function is a great way to do that. Describe comes from the psych package. And I say fast equals true here because I don't need the full set of descriptive statistics. I just want to get a quick sense. ID, that's not really a numeric variable. It's just a categorical. So we can ignore that one. Aggression, video games, and counts. Here are the means. So aggression has a mean of about 40, video games about 20, and counts about 18. 20 is actually a lot. So these are teenagers, I think, in this sample. So on average, a teenager's played about 20 hours worth of video games a week, which seems pretty high. Maybe not, though. I haven't played video games in a while. Some other good data exploration tips. So we've done both of these things before. The str or structure function is really good for looking at a variable and seeing what its label is. And the table function is good for breaking down kind of a crosstabs distribution of different scores. So we can run that. And this is just, I'm just running this for all 3 variables: aggression, video games, and counts, to get a sense of all the sort of breakdown here. And here we're getting the labels. So aggression, that's actually spelled wrong, video games in hours per week, and then callous, unemotional traits. And then we just get a little cross tabulation here of the different scores at different places. Not necessary, but just a valuable skill to know, just to get a sense of the distribution and how things look. Okay, so now we want to create a clean version of this data set that we can work with. And I'm going to use the same process that I've recommended to you before, where you create a new data frame called videogames.clean. So .clean, and you start with the original data frame that you loaded in, and then using the pipe operator, the only thing I need to do in this case, I'm going to rename this variable counts to give it something that is a little bit easier to type. So as you probably noticed, R is case sensitive. And so unless you want to type this carefully or copy and paste it every time you want to use it, if you mistype this, for example, make it all capitalized or all lowercase, R will not recognize it. So I'm just going to rename this thing as callus and put it all in lowercase. So this is going to change the name of that variable in the data set, and it's going to create a copy of the data set that I'm going to use for my modeling. So there's a copy of my data set up there. And then I can run the glimpse function to get a better sense of that it has been changed. And sure enough, there it is. There's that new variable name callus, which again is just that counts variable. Okay. All right, so housekeeping over. Now we're going to talk about the kind of specific nitty gritty around doing a moderator analysis. The first thing you want to do when you do a moderator analysis is actually run the model that you're interested in without a moderator. Okay. In the lecture video, I talk a little bit about this, and we also talked about what this specific moderation model was going to be with the video game data. So in this case, right, we're interested in the relationship between video games and aggression, but we're also interested in whether one's personality, right, specifically their sort of measure of antisocial personality, also could serve as a moderator of the relationship between video games and aggression. That's a key question. Okay. So the first thing to do before you start throwing in moderators is what I call the main effects. So what does the model tell us without the moderator? And that's what I run here starting on line 46. So I call this linear model 1. And it is a linear model using the LM function. Aggression is my outcome. Video games and callus are my two predictors. And notice there's no moderator there. It's just the two predictors. No interaction between the moderator and the main variable. And my data is videogames.clean. And then I just get a summary of that thing once it's done. And it prints out right below. Okay, so here are my results. And I'm gonna jump down to my coefficients. So here's my estimate for video games. It is positive, and it is statistically significant based on the p-value. So what does that mean? The more video games you play, the higher your aggression score is predicted to be. That's the relationship between those two. Okay. Callus, my measure of personality, is also positive and is also, in this case, highly statistically significant. So the more callous traits you have, the more aggressive you would report being as well. So these two variables are included in the same model together, so it's controlling for the other one. So this estimate for callus is after controlling for video games, and this estimate for video games is after controlling for callus. Think about those Venn diagrams, right? Those overlapping variables. So if I were to tell a story just based on the main effects, I would probably say, based on the main effects, yeah, the more video games you play, the more aggressive behavior you would report according to this scale. That's why moderator analysis is probably really important here, right? Because we suspect that there might be an interaction between these two things, whereby video games function differently for people with different personality types. And that's what we start to unpack when we start looking at these moderators. All right, so that's step one. Run the model without any moderation, any interaction. And now you can run the model with your moderator and you can compare. So that's what I do starting here on line 51. So this is linear model 2. And this is a model with a continuous X, variable of interest, and a continuous moderator. So again, the code is very similar. Linear model using the LM function. Aggression is the outcome. Video games is my predictor of interest. Callous is my moderator. And here is the interaction term. This is the thing that tells me whether or not moderation exists. And that is just the product of video games and callous. Okay. So I've indicated that we using an asterisk. That's all you need to do to create an interaction. You can also put a colon there too. R recognizes both of those sort of equivalently. So you can put a star there. All right, and my data again is videogames.clean. So I run that. Put this here. Oh, I should have noticed before. So my R squared in the original model was about 0.35. And here, my adjusted R squared is about 0.37. So I'm getting a little bit better with my model. I'm explaining, 37% of the variation in aggression scores. All right, so here's my moderation model. Here is my estimate of video games. Here's my estimate of callous. And here's my estimate of the interaction. Now, very important. When you are running a moderation model, you only need to interpret the interaction term, this bottom part right here. You do not interpret the main effects in a moderation model. The main effects are essentially uninterpretable in a moderation model, and that's by design. The only thing you're looking for, so in other words, just because callous isn't significant here doesn't mean that callous isn't significant. It means that the interaction is what you need to focus on. The interaction is what is actually significant. Okay, and the interaction is highly significant, 3 stars, little p-value, which means that moderation has occurred. We have a significant moderator. Now, how do we interpret this? There are a couple ways we could do this. First of all, we could interpret it statistically just by looking at it. This takes a lot of practice and can be really hard, but I'll show you what it means. What this is telling us, if this interaction is significant, is that for someone who is 1 unit higher on that callous scale, we would expect the slope of video games to go up by 0.03 units. For each 1 unit higher someone is on the callous scale, we would expect the slope, this thing, to be 0.02 or 03 units higher for every 1 unit of callous. So the change in callous is associated with a change in slope of video games, not a change in video games, but a change in the slope of video games. That's what moderation means. It means that that slope changes depending on where you are on the distribution of another variable. Now, I know that's really tricky, and I can only do that sort of on the fly because I've been doing this a while and I'm really comfortable with this paradigm. But a better way to do this is to just create a plot and interpret the results of the plot. And so to do that, there's a really neat package called interplot. So we're going to load that up. An interplot is going to help us with creating, and we get a, these aren't error messages. This is just a little message that the package is loaded up. We're going to interpret the results using interplot. Okay, so the command here is interplot. Then you put the name of the model, which in our case was linear model 2. And then you have to tell it, you have to give it a variable 1. And that one's going to go on the x-axis. That's your IV. Variable 2 is your moderator. And in this case, I put a little histogram on here to make it easier to interpret, but we'll have a look at that. Okay. So we run the interplot command and we get our results. Now I wish there was a little bit better built-in labeling, but there isn't, so we'll have to work with it. So on the left side here, this is the estimate of the slope of video games. So the slope of video games is on the left. The observed value of callous is on the right. So what exactly does that mean? Well, for someone who has a callous score of 0, the lowest level of callous, we would expect the slope of video games, that's this line right here, to actually be negative. So if you have the lowest levels of callous, that personality type, there's actually a negative relationship between the amount of video games you play and how aggressive you are. That's counterintuitive, right? That's opposite of what you might expect if you're thinking that video games and aggression are positively correlated. They're actually not for people who have low levels of callus. Now, if you are somebody out here who has high levels of callus, then absolutely that positive relationship exists. And the mean is sort of right around here at 20. So at 20, there's sort of a small positive relationship between video games and aggression. Below that, it's non-significant or negative. Above that, it's positive. And this is the estimate of the slope, this black line. And the gray part is what's called a confidence interval. So what you're looking for is, does this confidence interval overlap with 0, which is right here? And if it does, that means for those folks, there's essentially not a significant relationship between video games and aggression. Okay. Down here is the distribution of callus scores, just to give you a sense, like where are most of the people in this sample on this distribution? Most of the people are kind of right here in the middle. And there does not appear to be a very strong relationship between video games and aggression for people in this group. And there's actually an opposite relationship for people on this side. So that's the essence of moderation. If moderation did not exist in this model, we would have a perfectly flat line that overlapped with 0 the whole time, because that means that the slope of video games does not change depending on what level of callus you are. And so the fact that it changes is what really is telling the interesting story. Okay. All right, I'm going to pause there for part 1. Coming up in part 2, we're going to talk about continuous by dummy moderators, dummy by dummy moderators, dummy variables being just two categorical variables. And then we're going to talk about centering and a couple other things before we wrap up. But that's probably a good place to stop. And I'll talk to you soon.